Hello, my name is Fred Bronson, and for the last couple of years, it's been my great privilege to work with a gentleman who has had the most fascinating life, a bit dangerous, a bit exciting, and always interesting. And today I want you to meet David Junk. David, welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
I got a lot of questions for you today.
Fantastic.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
We have written a book called Rockin the Kremlin, and we're going to focus on that today.
Excellent.
Where I want to start is, you grew up as a Cold War kid on a farm in Ohio. How did you end up running a major record label in Russia?
Interesting question. So how does a kid go from a farm to a record label in Russia? Well, I was a Cold War kid growing up in Ronald Reagan's America. I was always afraid of Soviet ICBMs being launched at us because we lived near an Air Force base, a very important Air Force base near Dayton, Ohio, called Wright-Patterson. And we always knew that that would be a first target strike by the Russians if there ever was a nuclear war. So I lived under that threat growing up as a kid. Mutually assured destruction was a way of life. And we just were practicing going to the fallout shelter all the time, learning how to protect yourself from radiation. Of course, it was all nonsense. There's no surviving a nuclear war. But we were led into that false sense of security. I continued having great fears about the Russians even into college. One of my college classmates was actually killed by the Russians. She was in that passenger jet KAL-007 that was shot down over the Sea of Japan by a Soviet MiG in 1983. And we were in the same class together, and it was a great tragedy that really hit close to home for me. So between that and just generally being worried about a Russian first strike, I'm the last person you would expect to move to Russia and run a record label. I realized that this probably is the most exciting place in the world, Eastern Europe, after the fall of communism. So I decided to go back to America and learn business, because I needed a business degree to come back to this part of the world and work and help them transition from communism to capitalism. But I also needed to learn Russian. Everybody in Eastern Europe spoke Russian because they had to. They were forced to learn it in schools. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc was very strict about that. So Russian is a language that was useful, like English is in the business world. Russian would be useful in the Eastern European business world. So I studied Russian and got my business degree at San Francisco State and made my way back to Russia, where I answered a help wanted ad for a company called Polygram. And they were advertising in the Moscow Times. They were looking for a financial controller who spoke English. And I speak English, and I knew accounting. So I applied and immediately got hired to be the financial director for Polygram's office in Moscow. And they were the very first record company to open an office in Moscow. So that was exciting. That gave me the opportunity to work with the Cranberries and U2 and Bon Jovi and Bob Marley is on the roster, and Pavarotti. So what a great introduction to the international music business. But eventually, Polygram was merged with Universal Music. Universal bought Polygram, put the two companies together, and when that happened, I was offered the chance to be the CEO of the new Universal Music office in Russia. So I became the very first American to run a record label in the former Soviet Union. And that's how a farm boy, not the most usual path, but that's the path I took to make it into the music business.
Quite a unique journey. I can't imagine anybody else who's done exactly what you did to get from a farm in Ohio to running a high-powered record label in Moscow. Now, I know you, in the book we talk about, you had a mission Tell me what that mission was.
My mission was to keep this amazing job. This was the greatest job in the world, being head of a record company. And to do that, I had to be successful. And my mission was to not only help Russia develop into a modern music industry and help sell Universal's roster of artists in Russia, such as Eminem and the Black Eyed Peas and Dr. Dre and all these artists. But also I needed to sign and develop and discover new Russian artists and make them international stars, because that's what a real record executive does. My heroes like Clive Davis and David Geffen, I read about them all the time and how they developed artists like Simon and Garfunkel, Bruce Springsteen, Clive Davis, Whitney Houston. Clive Davis is famous for making careers out of artists, you know, international careers. And I wanted to be that same kind of record executive. So my mission was to find a Russian star that I could bring to the world, that I could develop and promote, and with luck, perhaps even bring to America. That was my major goal.
Well, we're going to find out more about that, but first I want to ask you something else. When I tell people about the book, and they say, well, what's it about? And I say, well, David lived in Russia in good times and bad times. So when you arrived, these were the good times. Can you describe why they were good times and what was so good about them?
The good times were golden years. They really were. I was there to help the Russians develop into a real market economy and help their music industry modernize. Their music industry was something inherited from the Soviet Union, where there were no songwriter rights, there was no protection for artists. The Russian mafia controlled the music industry. 90% of the entire Russian record industry was controlled by the Russian mafia. So I had a lot of obstacles facing me, but the fact that I was able to put together a team of really talented Russians, young Russians, and build the #1 record label in the country and promote these artists, not just in Russia, but around the world, those were some really golden years. And I met a lot of friends, and I met a Russian woman and married her and raised a family in Moscow. And I met some amazing people in my life. The most amazing Russian man I ever met was my wife's father, Yuri. He was a nuclear scientist at the famous Kurchatov Institute in Russia. That's where they invented their version of the atomic bomb. He was an award-winning nuclear scientist. But through him, I got to see how there was a time when Russia was on the road to democracy. He's one of those men that was out there with Boris Yeltsin when Yeltsin was standing on the tank, calling for the overthrow of the Soviet Union. Yuri was not a communist, although his father was a Soviet admiral in the Navy, a lifelong Communist Party member. But Yuri was not. He chose a different path. And I admired him so much and learned so much about the Russian character through him. And I can confirm to Sting that Russians love their children too. I watched his love of my wife, his daughter, and his grandchildren, my sons. And that really impressed me. And those were really the golden years. I had a dacha, or country home as they call it, on the Volga River. It's like our Mississippi River here. It's one of the most historic and important rivers in Russia. My dacha was made from log cabins. There was an old-fashioned banya there, so I would cut wood during the day and stack it up in the oven at night and cook the banya up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This is very traditional Russian living. And play Russian billiards with the neighbors in the countryside. It was a sanctuary from the pollution and the pressure of the city of Moscow, and it really made living in Russia a real joy for many years.
So even though you were living in good times, there were a lot of problems with the music industry in Russia. What were your biggest problems with the way the Russian music industry was running when you got there?
When I got to Russia, the biggest problem I was facing was the Russian mafia. They, like I mentioned before, they control 90% of the music market. When I was appointed CEO of Universal, I was summoned to the London headquarters, and I like to describe it. It felt like a scene out of James Bond. It really did. I was brought into the office of the head of legal counsel, a man named Richard Constant. He was like a Winston Churchill type character, right? And he told me, we've had enough of these pirates stealing Elton John's music and stealing Bon Jovi's music. You need to go back to Russia, David, and organize the music industry into fighting pirates. We have to shut this down, no matter how dangerous it is. This is what you need to do. And I was excited. I wasn't scared. I mean, I was naive. I was probably very, very naive. But I was just honored to be asked to do such an important thing and to lead this effort was really great. Universal at the time, we were the biggest record company in the world, so it kind of was our duty to be the leaders in fighting piracy. And when I returned to Moscow to start on this mission, my first job was to get all of these record labels together, all the heads of the record labels. And again, another movie scene. It felt like, if you recall the scene from The Godfather, where Don Corleone brings all the families together, and they discuss how they need to unite against the common enemy. That's what this was really like. I brought all the different record labels together in the downtown office, and we made our peace. And we, for a moment, we're not cheating each other, stabbing each other in the back. And I presented them with the idea, let's form a group, a national group, that they do this in all the other countries in the world where there's modern music markets. Let's do the same thing here and unite and fight our common enemy, which is the music pirates, the Russian mafia. That's our common enemy. So when we gathered, we took a vote to determine who's in, who's out, and enough of the record companies were in. We were able to form our own organization, and that organization was charged with fighting pirates and going out on pirate raids with the police and raiding pirate factories. Certainly one of the more dangerous parts of my job. I had to wear a bulletproof vest. I had to go out on runs with Interpol agents, and my job as a record label executive was to, when we entered the factory and confiscated the counterfeit CDs, my job was to verify, oh, that's Universal, that's some other label, that's not ours. And then I would be responsible to go to court and defend Elton John's copyrights in a Russian court. And that's what the courts would use to prosecute the pirates. And it was certainly dangerous, and there's one episode I talk about in the book where we discovered that a pirate factory was located on an army base. And when we tried to enter the army base with our police, you know, we had the Moscow police escort, we had some big shots from Interpol, but in Russia, the military police trumped the citizen police, and we were not allowed entry into the factory grounds. And that was just proof right there that not only was Russia full of music piracy, but it was being protected at the highest level. Russian generals were protecting the music pirates. So the challenge was really great.
You had some huge successes, and one of them was, I want you to tell me about two young girls that you signed to Universal Music Russia.
When I became CEO and decided I needed to sign a Russian artist or act to become a real executive, I knew that I needed to find an artist or band that was unique, that could compete with the Britney Spears and the Christina Aguileras and the Backstreet Boys and everyone else that was popular at the time. I needed something really special. In the history of the music industry, it's mainly English-speaking artists that top the charts. It's very difficult for a foreign act to break into the American market. British music often does. Sometimes German, sometimes French, it's rare. Never had a Russian artist, never had anyone from Eastern Europe become a successful recording artist in the international music market or in America. So the challenge was great, and I was looking everywhere. And then one evening I saw a music video on MTV, and it was a duo called Tattoo, and there were these two young schoolgirls, and on one side of the fence they were standing there in the pouring rain, and on the other side of the fence was the community, their teachers and parents and local leaders. And the two girls looked at the other folks standing there, and in a tremendous act of just provocation, kiss in the pouring rain. And it was not a sexy kiss, a romantic kiss, it was a rebellious kiss. And that's what Tattoo was. They were the Russian Sex Pistols. I mean, they were a provocative act meant to stir up trouble. And that's what they did. And when I saw that video and I heard that song, I knew I had found my international breakthrough from Russia. And all I could think about was signing them to Universal. But I had a lot of resistance. My own staff, my own very smart Russian marketing team and sales team were very hesitant. This was dangerous. Homosexuality had been a crime in Russia, and LGBTQ rights were very suppressed in the current Russia. This was going to cause trouble not only with the Russian Orthodox Church, but with the Kremlin, who were always watching us anyway because we were a foreign record label. But I knew I had to do this. I could not pass on this opportunity. And the final thing that convinced me that this is the right move is we asked our radio promoter, what do you think of the song? The first song was called "Ya sashla suma." In English, it's all the things she said, but the Russian version was "Ya sashla suma." And he goes, it's a hit. It's a radio hit. And in the music business, there's nothing more important than a radio hit. So that was the sign I needed to move forward and offer them a record deal, and that's what we did. We signed them up to Universal. But my first problem, before I even got started, was I learned that the manager for this band, a crazy guy named Ivan, really interesting character, like Malcolm McLaren from the Sex Pistols, just looking to provoke. That's all he ever did. He had signed away the rights to the very first single to a gangster record label. And they were going to produce the first song and first hit. And without that, without that first single, there would not have been a Tattoo. There would not have been this great breakthrough. I would have lost it to the Gangsters. So I had to ask my bosses at Universal, and I wasn't able to tell them why, but I had to ask them for the largest single payout to a new artist in the history of Eastern Europe. It was $100,000, and at that time it was the largest record contract ever. And I was able to convince my bosses in Universal this is the right thing. They trusted me at this point. And so I paid the manager for Tattoo, and he got the rights back from the Gangsters with that money. And then the rest is history. Tattoo went on to become the biggest selling music act in the history of the music industry from Russia. They went gold or platinum in 27 countries and was the first debut act to hit #1 in Japan. Even the Beatles didn't do that. So they were big. They were the biggest artist I could ever have hoped for, and that really was my biggest success in the music industry.
Here you have this Russian act that you've turned into superstars, but you also dealt with American and superstars from the West coming to Russia. who were some of the biggest artists that you had to deal with when they traveled to Russia?
Probably the biggest artist I ever hosted in Moscow was Mariah Carey. And Mariah came at a particularly important time for us in Russia because a lot of artists were scared to come, or their managers were scared to let them come. There was a lot of chaos in Russia at the time, a lot of gangster fights in the streets, bombings. There was some terrorism already beginning to happen. And David Copperfield had brought his show to Russia and was unable to leave because he wasn't paying the right bribes. And so he ended up having to cancel part of his upcoming European tour. So Russia had a bad reputation for international artists. But Mariah came, she decided she was going to perform in the Kremlin Palace. Her album was really hitting the top of the charts. It was a new album called Charm Bracelet. She had a big song with Busta Rhymes that was #1 on the radio. So she came. She decided to come and perform there. And it was the most exciting thing for us because as a record label, you want artists to come and tour. That's how you sell more records. And my young team were eager to prove that they were able to host not just small artists, not just medium artists, but the biggest artists in the world. They were ready for it. And that's exactly what happened. So when Mariah arrived, I'm telling you, her entourage was bigger than the President of the United States, who had also come to Moscow, George Bush, just a few years earlier. She had more tractor trailers, more staff. Of course, I don't think the president flies with a choreographer or stylist like Mariah did, but it was just so impressive to see her team come in and really take over the country. She was the biggest thing to ever happen to Moscow by that point, and it was a tremendous success. I think the highlight was seeing her reaction when she stepped on Red Square for the first time. In fact, everyone who sees Red Square for the first time, their mouths just drop. It's the most amazing thing they've ever seen. But to see an artist like that, who's been all over the world, and to still be able to see the shock on her face, that was something. That was really something. The concert was a big success. Afterwards, she waited backstage, and rich people and powerful people lined up to give her gifts like they were paying honor to the Queen. She was the Queen. And she told me it was a great event for her. She was just a little disappointed that the folks in the front row with the really expensive seats, you know, the $5,000 and up tickets, those were mainly the rich oligarchs and the Kremlin bureaucrats. They wouldn't dance to her songs, and that bothered her a little bit. But everyone else in the venue was dancing on their feet the whole night. And they saw an artist sing. I mean, when she sang Vision of Love, one of her very first hit songs, it brought a tear to my eye. I just, seeing their reaction, seeing this crowd watch a true master perform, and her vocal ability is just unmatched by anybody that had performed there. It was so impressive.
Wow.
So Mariah, I think, would be the biggest artist I ever hosted. I hosted Enrique Iglesias and Elton John and Bryan Adams, a lot of really big artists. But I do think Mariah made the biggest impact of anyone I ever hosted in Moscow.
Wow. Well, she is an amazing personality and star, and what an experience that was for you. David, there's a chapter in the book called Band Troubles, in which you talk about two artists in particular that maybe weren't as easy to work with as Mariah Carey and Sting and Enrique Iglesias. Tell me about those two artists.
Sure. Well, you know, Fred, being a CEO of a record company is really unique in that you work with a wide range of artists. And you don't always choose the artists you want to work with. You work with the artists that are coming to your country, to Russia, in my situation. So I would work with some of the most amazing jazz artists like Diana Krall or Herbie Hancock, or classical artists, or pop stars, Elton John, Bryan Adams, some of the biggest stars in the world. But there were also some dark artists, and Universal had a couple of the darkest artists in the world on the roster when I was CEO. One of them was Marilyn Manson. Marilyn, of course, had a reputation already before he brought his tour to Russia for 2 sold-out shows. He had been arrested in, I think it was Michigan, for assaulting a police officer on stage. It was the Gods, Guns, and Government tour, which was full of satanic imagery and all kinds of just dark symbolism. So when I get the call from Interscope, which is Marilyn Manson's record label in Los Angeles, and they called me and told me, guess what? Marilyn Manson's doing 2 shows in your country. Can you make sure everything goes smoothly? I'm like, well, okay. This is going to be a lot more challenging than Bryan Adams, that's for sure. So I was nervous. I was nervous because I knew what Marilyn was singing about, and I knew the troubles this was causing. And I was worried the Russian Orthodox Church was going to be protesting out in front of our record company offices. I thought for sure the Kremlin was going to be inquiring, why am I bringing into the country this subversive, dangerous character? As it turns out, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. The church was still weak at this point. They hadn't regained their full power. They would years later would block Marilyn Manson from performing. But this time they did not. They did not stop him. What did stop him, however, was Mother Nature, of all things. Marilyn Manson came to Russia during the Russian winter, and we know that rarely works out for folks who come at that time of year. His tour bus ran off the Leningrad highway on its way from Finland through St. Petersburg to Moscow. It was in a snowstorm, and the concert had to be postponed a day. Of course, there were rumors throughout the city that, the Kremlin stopped it, or the church finally, wouldn't relent and demanded that this concert be canceled. But no, not at all. It was all Mother Nature this time, and Marilyn's bus eventually got pulled out of the ditch, and one day later he performed a sold-out show in Olympic Stadium, and no one got arrested, and I stayed out of jail too. So it was overall a successful evening, and Interscope was happy that their superstar, dangerous superstar, made it out alive. Another band that was one of the darkest in Universal at the time is an East German band called Rammstein. And they are, I guess you could say, East Germany's answer to West Germany's Scorpions, right? If the Scorpions sang about the wind of change and peace and unity, Rammstein sang about cannibalism and nationalism and torture and all kinds of crazy dark themes. And they used a lot of fascist imagery in their shows. And so much fire and pyrotechnics, that their shows were dangerous. And you had to have a lot of firemen nearby with a lot of equipment in case something went wrong. But that was the allure of their shows. They were really the most exciting live shows happening at the time. So when Rammstein came to Russia, again, I was nervous. I was nervous because I knew the joke, they were not serious. It was a show. I was in on it. Anyone who, was intelligent knew this was show business. But I was worried that people, maybe young Russians didn't know that this was a bit of a show, and they would get riled up regarding the nationalist, fascist imagery and all of that. I was wrong again. I didn't need to worry so much. I met with the band the night before. We had a nice, lovely dinner. They're soft-spoken, bleeding heart intellectuals. That's probably a secret that I'm revealing to the world. These guys have nothing going on regarding fascism whatsoever. So it was really a shocker that such a dangerous band could be really so soft and so smart and so nice. But what I did have to worry about was those pyrotechnics and the fire that they create at their show. And so before the concert, I get a phone call from their record label, which was in Germany, Universal Germany. And again, David, can you please make sure everything goes smoothly? And by the way, you need to make sure the fire marshal is okay. We've heard about people having to pay bribes there in Russia, and we don't want our band in jail because they wouldn't pay the fire marshal a bribe or whatever it takes. So can you please take care of that? And I thought, well, you know, I'm not the one to do this. This is the promoter, and we have a really good promoter working, a guy named Ed. He was the one that would bring all the rough and rowdy acts, not the Elton Johns and the Paul McCartneys. He would bring more of the Metallicas and the Marilyn Mansons and the Rammsteins and those types. And so I counted on Ed to take care of things, but I couldn't find him before the show. I couldn't contact him. As typical, the day before a show, he's busy giving out free tickets or taking care of problems or putting out fires, so to speak. That's what a promoter does, and it's almost impossible to reach them by phone the day before the show or the day, especially the day of the show. And we couldn't find him, and we didn't know if everything had been agreed to with the fire marshal. I was panicking. It was just a half hour before the show starts, and Ed is nowhere to be found. The stadium is full. The band is ready. Everything is geared up to go, and I spot the fire marshal at the back of the stage, and there's no one with him. And I'm thinking, this guy's here to arrest somebody. No one is taking care of this person. So I panic. I call my secretary back at the office, and I say, get $5,000 out in cash out of the safe and bring it here as fast as you can. I'm going to have to pay off somebody. I can tell. Otherwise, this band is going to end up in a Russian jail. So she gets to the stadium. It's hard because the show's starting. I run out. I get the envelope, $5,000. $100 bills, that's how they like it in Russia when you pay bribes. Stick it in my jacket. I'm running in. I'm delayed to get back into the stadium because of the crowd. And all of a sudden I hear guitars and drums. And then you can see the fire. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm too late. I'm too late. And I rush backstage and I spot the fire marshal. And he's not moving. He hasn't moved towards the band to arrest anybody, and all I can see is a wall of fire between the audience and the band. I mean, the explosions were nonstop, and everything was fine. Everything looked good. So I walk back out to the front of the stage to see how it looks there, and I'm looking around, and all of a sudden I get a tap on the back, and it's Ed, the promoter. And I say, Ed, is everything all fine? Is the fire marshal? And he winks at me. And he moves on to the next problem because he's got 100 more to take care of. But I knew that he had taken care of whatever. I don't know what he did, but Rammstein performed brilliantly, and thousands and thousands of Russians were singing Du hast. They probably don't speak German, but they were singing in German that night, and no one got in trouble, and no one went to jail. And I sent another band on their way safely and made my colleagues in Germany very happy about that.
So a successful end.
Successful end, yes.
Now, eventually, your responsibilities expanded into Eastern Europe, especially, many countries, but including Ukraine. I'd love to hear your history with Ukraine.
When I had the success with Tattoo and the other artists that we were signing, and they were hitting #1. I signed 6 artists, and all 6 managed to make the top of the charts. And we were doing pretty well with selling international music too. Eminem had sold hundreds of thousands of records in Russia, and this really helped develop hip hop. So I was doing really well in my job at that point and getting some recognition outside of Russia. And my bosses in London were noticing this, and in Los Angeles at Universal. And I was eventually promoted to become vice president of the entire Eastern European region. And that was a great opportunity because now I was no longer helping Russia develop its music industry. I started working with smaller countries and all the other former countries of the Soviet Union. So Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Iceland, Poland, Czech, Slovakia, all those countries, we were still developing them into modern music markets. Bulgaria was a very important market. I went to Belarus. I was the first Western record executive in Belarus. It was scary. It was definitely scary. Lukashenko was a dictator then, and I don't think he appreciated Western pop music, and I doubt that he does now. I went to faraway places like Kazakhstan, right on the border with China, and visited Almaty. So I saw some really exotic places, and I was always the very first Western record executive to step foot in those places. So I got a lot of nice welcoming parties, and was asked to participate in song contests and a lot of interviews on TV, talking about the importance of music and the importance of protecting the music industry. The country that I loved working in the most, though, was Ukraine. I always loved Ukraine. I had visited Ukraine as a student way back in 1992, only from the train. I was coming home from a summer course studying Russian in Leningrad, and I took the train to Budapest via Ukraine. So I went through the whole country of Ukraine. I wasn't even allowed to get off the train, but I saw the Ukrainian countryside from my train window, and I saw those golden fields of wheat, and that reminded me of my family farm back in Ohio. And I knew I felt a connection with Ukrainians, if only for the agricultural connection. But fast forward 7 years later, it's 1999, and now I'm a record executive with Universal Music, and I'm there to open up the very first Western record company in Kyiv. And that became, I think, one of the most important things I did in my career. Ukraine, for centuries, has been overshadowed by Russia, politically, militarily, obviously, and culturally. Frankly, a lot of Americans don't know that much about Ukrainian culture because we often assume it's Russian culture, but it's not. It's not. They're really, Ukraine has its own beautiful, rich, and deep culture that has never been shown to the world like it should be, and hopefully like it will be. But I was able to help at least with music by opening up that music market in Ukraine. And by starting a record company there, Universal was the first, but others followed, and eventually the Ukrainian music industry grew, and they started to develop some of their own stars. And they have been, frankly, at the Eurovision Song Contest, more successful than any of the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe. It's incredible how many times they've been, and I know, Fred, you are an expert on Eurovision, and we talk about how fond we are of the Eurovision Song Contest and how important it is. But for Ukraine, it really was their chance to show the world they're not Russia, they're Ukraine. And they've won it twice in recent times.
Even more now.
Oh, with the recent victory with Kalush Orchestra, that was their third victory, right? And so helping Ukraine escape from the shadows of Russia, at least culturally, at least with music, that was one of the most satisfying things I've done in my career.
Now, you did go back to Ukraine in May of 2023, which I thought was a very brave thing to do. But tell me why you went back and what you experienced there.
Well, I wanted to see Ukraine. Since the war broke out, my heart had been breaking completely. I was devastated by what the Russians were doing. And I wanted to see how the friends I had in Ukraine, the artists I'd worked with in the music industry, how they were holding up after this war. It had been a year of war. So in May of 2023, I decided to go back, and it was right when the Eurovision Song Contest was scheduled to be broadcast on TV. As you know, Ukraine had won the year before and had earned the rights to host Eurovision. But because of the war, the broadcasters had decided to move the contest to Liverpool, and it would be broadcast from Liverpool that evening. So I wanted to be in Ukraine that night because I knew what a big deal it was. I knew what a tragedy it was to lose that. Eurovision is a great thing for a country. It brings in revenue, tourism. It's a very prestigious thing to host the Eurovision Song Contest. It's a week-long event, so it's a big deal. And I just felt like it was important to be with friends and colleagues there that evening. So I flew to Warsaw, and you can't fly to Ukraine. It's a no-fly zone because of the war. The Russian MiGs will shoot you out of the sky if you try that. They've done that before to a passenger jet. So I took a 17-hour train ride from Warsaw to Kyiv. And when I was there, I met up with my friends, and I saw some terrible things. I saw a lot of bullet-ridden cars and bombed-out malls and shopping centers and apartment blocks. I saw a lot of the damage that the Russians had done. But I also saw heroism and great strength and courage demonstrated by everybody, from the folks that make the trains run on time, to the hotels, to the taxi drivers who rushed me to a bomb shelter when I was out. So the Saturday evening when the song contest was broadcast, I gathered with friends in their apartment. We were all excited to root on the Ukrainian entry, which was Tvorchi, a great electronic duo. And the moment the TV show comes on and the logo for Eurovision and that music, introducing the show comes on, and all of Europe is watching this live, 300 million people. That's the exact moment the Russians decide to launch a hypersonic missile at the city of Kyiv. And it was the first time a hypersonic missile had ever been used, ever in a combat situation. So it was expected that this is considered the fastest missile ever created. And of course the alarms go off, the air sirens go off. So the taxi driver very bravely took me to my fallout shelter, bomb shelter. We knew a hypersonic missile was on the way to Kyiv. The Ukrainians are so advanced, they've created an app for your phone that tells you what kind of missile is coming and when it's expected to hit. It's incredible. I guess a war creates these kinds of things out of necessity. But so I knew I had a certain amount of time to get to safety. And that's where I stayed the rest of the evening. I missed the entire Eurovision Song Contest. Fortunately, and I'm very proud of this, an American Patriot missile knocked that hypersonic missile out of the sky, intercepted it. That had never happened before. And the Ukrainians have shown that they can take American technology and do things that even we had never done with this American technology. So that was a very, very heartwarming moment to know that our American technology had saved the city, saved my butt too as well, that evening. I unfortunately missed the show, but I still was so happy to have been in Kyiv for that moment. It was important for me to be there. And even though Ukraine didn't win that evening, it still was a big deal for Tvorchi to have made it, because the Russians even launched missiles at their hometown the night of Eurovision. The Russians were upset. They had been disinvited by Eurovision, and so they were sending a message.
That's brilliant. Well, we'll get back to Ukraine in a minute when we bring you more up to date. But we talked about good times in Russia and acknowledge there were bad times. What eventually led you to leave Russia?
Well, I was never afraid of the gangsters in Russia. The pirates in Russia didn't scare me. The oligarchs, I could handle those. It was the terrorism that finally drove me away and put my family in a safer place. And even then, it took a while. There were several events that happened over the years that I was there, starting. The real first terrorism started, I think, in 1995, 1996, after the first Chechen war began. Russia has had many conflicts with the Republic of Chechnya in the Caucasus, dating back centuries. Even Tolstoy would write about this. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia regained its freedom, and the Soviet Union broke up, most countries went their own way. Ukraine became a country, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and most of the republics in Russia agreed to be part of the new Russian Federation. But Chechnya said, "Niet, no thank you. We're our own country. We want to be like the Czechs or the Slovaks or the Ukrainians. We want our own country." And they started to fight for it, and Russia started sending in its army, and hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed there. There was tremendous destruction and leveling of the capital of Grozny, and that led to terrorist attacks nonstop for several years, and they got progressively worse. One time I was walking with a Universal executive in Moscow on the main thoroughfare. It's called Tverskaya Ulitsa, and a bomb went off in the Pushkin metro. And I had to rush that Universal executive out of the country. And he said, "You want to come with me, David? You want to get out of here?" "No, I'm staying." But I sent him back on his way to London. There was another incident where black widows, these are women whose husbands have been killed by the Russian army. And they have taken on the role of avenging their husband's death. So they came to Moscow with suicide belts, and they would show up sometimes outside of rock concerts in the ticketing line, and hundreds were killed by these black widows. They did the same thing in airports. One of the most frightening incidents happened in a theater called Dubrovka. They were staging a play that's similar to like Les Miserables with Russian soldiers, basically. It was called Nord-Ost. And my wife and family had just been there to see that a week earlier, but I had forgotten. I'd forgotten they'd gone to see it. And so when I'm sitting in a restaurant one evening talking to a Russian artist who I'm trying to sign to Universal, there's a commotion in the restaurant, and someone rolls out a TV from the kitchen, and we see on live TV that Chechen terrorists have taken over this theater, and there's several hundred people being held hostage inside. And this went on for several days. And the Russians are terrible at anti-terrorism. Their security services have failed and failed again. Every rescue operation is botched. They're just not good at this. And of course, they botched this one too. They pumped fentanyl gas into this theater, and it just knocked out everybody, the terrorists, but also the hostages. And in the end, they were not organized enough to have an antidote ready to bring the hostages back to life. And over 100 people died that evening from gas poisoning. Such a senseless way to die. Yeah. And all they had to do was have an antidote there, but they didn't. So if that was pretty bad. That really shook me. There were some Americans that died in that incident. Again, I thought my wife was there. I panicked, called home. She wasn't, thank God. But that's how it was starting to cut close to home. But the incident that really pushed me over the edge and really pushed me to plan to leave Russia was the tragedy at Beslan. Beslan is a small village in the Caucasus, and it was September 1st, 2004, the first day of school, the traditional first day of school in Russia, where it's really a parade. Every school throughout the country has activities and events, and the teachers and the parents and the kids get together and they celebrate. This is the first day of school. They ring a bell. It's really exciting, a long tradition. This was a tragic that year in 2004. Chechen terrorists again took over this school and held 1,100 people hostage. 900 of them were children. And this played out on live TV, just like the other hostage situations occurred. And you could almost feel from the beginning, this is going to go wrong again. You almost knew the Russian security services were going to botch this once again. And sure enough, they did. They sent attack helicopters, tanks with thermobarbaric shells that explode and cause fire. It was not a rescue operation, it was a military operation to kill terrorists. Unfortunately, several hundred kids died that day. Teachers died that day. All the terrorists were killed, but also so many innocent lives died that day because of the Russian security services being incompetent again. And I recall this time I was in my office at the record company just watching this on CNN happen. And I teared up. I couldn't handle it anymore. This was just too much for me. I was frightened for my family. You know, my boys were going to school in a Russian school. This could have easily been them. So that's when I made plans to leave Russia. And I let Universal know that I would be leaving at the end of 2005 and not continuing on. And it was sad, but I had to do it at that point. It was just so dangerous to live there.
Sure. Well, I think anyone would understand that and want to do the same thing as you to protect their family. Now, you did go back years later and ran Gibson Guitars, but then things got bad again. Tell me about the effect of, Sochi, Crimea, and the first invasion of Ukraine. How did that affect you?
Correct. I was there for the first invasion of Crimea. So the year is 2013. I'm living in Los Angeles. I hadn't been back to Russia in quite some time. I had worked for a record label in Burbank called Machete Records in the Latin music industry, and I had done well, but it wasn't the same. I clearly had something special when I was in Russia that I wasn't able to duplicate here in America. So I was eager to go back. I wanted to go back to help the Russians again. But there was not an opportunity until Gibson Guitars called and said they're looking to open up their very first guitar showroom in Moscow, and there's no one else that will do it. No one wanted to go back there. And they asked me if I would be interested. And I said, of course, I'm ready. There's just one catch. You have to pass an aptitude test. It's the same aptitude test all of our Gibson employees pass. It's usually used in the factory, but don't worry, you'll pass it. I couldn't pass the darn thing. I've never been good at these, how many boxes are in this pyramid? How, what would you do in this situation, that situation? I'm just terrible at these tests. And I kept failing, and they had no one else to send. And again, I like to point out movie scenes that remind me of the situation. But if you recall the movie Skyfall with James Bond, and he's been retired and in hiding and put out to pasture, and he can't pass the test to get back into the Secret Service, even though they desperately need him to help take on this new enemy. So they pass him anyway. M sends him on the job anyway, even though he never passed. Same with me. Gibson calls me and says, listen, we're going to send you anyway. You can't pass this test, but we need somebody. So I went to Moscow, and I opened from scratch a Gibson guitar showroom there. I didn't even have a bank account with Gibson, didn't have any contracts. It really was creating something out of thin air. And it was an exciting job. I mean, guitars, not something I knew anything about at the time. You know, working in the record industry, of course I knew a lot about music, but I didn't always know what guitars these bands were using or why a guitarist would choose a Fender over a Gibson. I didn't really understand that. But I was really excited about the opportunity, and certainly I knew how to open a business in Russia, and that's what Gibson wanted the most. So they sent me there, and I managed to open the showroom, and I had a big event that really launched us in Gibson and invited the guitarist for the Scorpions, Rudolf Schenker, to participate on a panel about technology. And it was called, "Is Technology a Wind of Change?" And you know the Scorpions are very famous for that song, "Wind of Change," became an anthem for the newly liberated Eastern Europe. And it was such a popular song back then that Mikhail Gorbachev had invited the Scorpions into the Kremlin to meet him, and he thanked them for this song because it really was a great inspirational song. And so when we had this panel, Rudolph talked about meeting Gorbachev and talked about how important it was that the Scorpions were able to write that song and helps create an anthem for this important period of time in the history of Eastern Europe. So things were going great with Gibson. The showroom was beautiful. Everyone loves Gibson guitars. I had every artist eager to work with us. My job was essentially to give guitars to rock stars because that's what they would do. They would go on TV or they would perform in concert, and that's how Gibson advertises its guitars, is by having a superstar rock star perform. Sure. I mean, Angus Young of AC/DC and Slash of Guns N' Roses have probably done more for Gibson, just playing Gibson guitars and only Gibson guitars, than any amount of advertising on TV could pay for. So that's what I was trying to do in Russia. And things were going really well. I thought 2014 was going to be one of the greatest years for Gibson in Russia. I thought it was going to be a great year for me because things were really, really going on the right track. I was doing really well with Gibson there. And I thought 2014 was going to be a great year for Russia and the world because the Sochi Olympics were happening. The Sochi Winter Olympics were happening in February. And this was a chance, I naively thought, for the leaders of the world, you know, Putin, obviously, and Xi in China, and Merkel in Germany, and Obama in America, to come together and, in the spirit of the Olympic flame, promote world peace. It just felt like it was going to happen to me. And I really was so excited. I went to Sochi. I went to see the opening ceremonies. And it was the most amazing thing. These massive installations, bigger than anything I've seen at the Rose Bowl parade or anywhere else. I mean, the massive, massive installations they were bringing on floats inside the stadium were all a tribute to Russian culture. Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Pushkin. It was, you know, it brought a tear to my eye. I was so proud of Russia at this moment. And the world was watching and seeing what I was proud of. I thought for sure this was a new era of peace. Then, to my great surprise, Tattoo comes out and is performing. And this is 2014, you know, gay rights had been suppressed for quite some time now. The Russian government had joined forces with the Russian Orthodox Church, and they were passing a lot of anti-gay laws right now and discriminating against the LGBTQ community in a big way. So it was quite a shock to see Tattoo representing Russia on the world stage. But it also made sense because at that time they were by far the most well-known Russian cultural act in the world. More people knew who Tattoo were than anyone. So it was fitting that they would end up in the pantheon of Russian greats, right there with Pushkin and Chekhov and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. But I was very proud, and I thought, oh my gosh, world peace could be breaking out maybe Russia has turned a corner with discrimination against gays, and maybe things will lighten up and there'll be less harassment and anti-LGBTQ pressure after the Olympics. But I was wrong. Yeah. I was completely wrong. After the Olympic flame was extinguished, just a short while later, there was demonstrations in Kiev, Maidan Square, and the Secret Service there, called the Berkut, started shooting innocent protesters in the square. That resulted in a riot, and the Russian-supported Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, had to flee the country because he had ordered the murder of all those demonstrators in the square. He flies out, the Russians take care of him, they protect him, but a new, more Western-friendly government rises up in its place, and Putin uses this chaos and this confusing situation to invade Crimea. And that's how the very first invasion of Ukraine happened in 2014. And that was really the beginning of the end for me and Gibson in Russia.
So you left eventually the second time.
I did. I wanted to leave right away. I was angry at this, what the Russians had done. And I was also really tired of hearing about this Russian patriotism that was spilling over everywhere. They were so proud that they had taken Crimea from Ukraine. People that I thought shouldn't think that way. Right. My landlord, for example, loved Americans. The entire apartment was in this New York City motif. She loved having me live in her apartment there in Moscow, and would come over and talk about this or that about America, you know. And so I was really shocked the next time I saw her, where she was proud that Russia was now taking over Crimea, and they were teaching the Ukrainians a lesson. And the most important thing to her was Crimea had the best beaches. During the Soviet Union, all the Russians used to go there, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, they stopped going there. Now they're all headed back. And I just thought that was terrible. I had an old friend from the music industry who actually worked for me at Universal Music. And I was having lunch with him one day, and he told me how excited he was about this new opportunity for Russia and Crimea. And I argued with him. I said, what about our Ukrainian friends and colleagues at Universal who you used to work with, who you used to work closely with? And they helped us. They helped us develop Tattoo into becoming an international star. If it weren't for the Ukrainians, we might not have had international success with Tattoo. And he was blinded by the propaganda, brainwashed by this Kremlin propaganda. He believed sincerely that Nazis were in charge in Kiev, and that our friends and colleagues were the ones brainwashed by the Nazis. It was a tragedy for me. It was really terrible. And then at Gibson, one of my colleagues, he was the guitar tech. He was the guy in charge of fixing all the guitars. He would not stop talking about how the Tsar is coming back. He didn't want the Soviet Union to return. He wanted the Russian Empire to return, back to the days of Peter the Great. And that was what was exciting for him. And I got fed up. I couldn't handle it. And I think the final straw was when I saw one of the artists I had signed, a jazz saxophonist. I had brought him to New York and helped him present his album in the Birdland nightclub in New York City. And I was really proud of what we had done with him. Well, one day I'm walking near Red Square, and there's a big concert on Red Square, and I see above the stage this banner. It says, "Crimea is ours." And there's all these pop stars and politicians talking and rallying and getting excited about this great achievement, that Crimea's back with the motherland. And then my jazz saxophonist comes on stage and starts tooting his saxophone, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I turned and I walked out, and I knew I had to leave. I knew I had to leave.
Well, I've got one more question for you. People are going to read this book, hopefully, and enjoy it. What message do you want them to take away from Rockin the Kremlin?
There's two messages, important messages I want people to take away. The first message is I want people to read this book and realize that, yes, America did help Russia after the fall of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of people like me that rushed in to do what we could to help Russia transition from communism to capitalism. There are a lot of skeptics out there who say Putin invaded Ukraine because he was worried about NATO expansion. I don't believe that whatsoever. That's not the reason he invaded Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine because he runs Russia like a mafia state, and he's Don Corleone. And Ukraine has very valuable natural resources in the east, and he and his cronies wanted his hands on that. That's why Russia invaded. But a lot of those same Putin apologists who blame the West for Putin invading Ukraine are the same people, often professors, I've noticed, who haven't lived in Russia, who have a lot of opinions about Russia. These are the same people that say America was a sore winner. We didn't do anything to really help Russia like we should have. But I'm living proof that we did. I was there 15 years doing this, doing what I could to bring American know-how, market principles, supply and demand, sales and marketing, all these generally accepted accounting principles, really helping Russia move away from the ashes of the Soviet Union. And I think it's one of the most important things that happened after the Cold War that kept the peace for as long as it did. And if Putin hadn't if Putin hadn't become prime minister, let's just say that, or eventually president, and Yeltsin had continued on the path of democracy, then people like my wife's father, Yuri, who stood on the tank and promoted and supported Yeltsin back then when the Soviet Union collapsed, his dreams would have been fulfilled. But that didn't happen. But it was not because America didn't try. We did try, and I am a testament to that. That's the one thing I want to make sure people understand reading this book. The second thing is that Russia destroyed these bridges. Putin did this. We built these cultural bridges, and his invasion of Ukraine in 2022 washed it all away, for sure. Universal is closed. Gibson is gone. The music industry is still there, but it's not what it was. Most, if not all, good Western corporations have moved out, stopped doing business. Sure, there's a few bad ones that are still there, but by and large, the Western banks and the Western companies have moved out of Russia. And that's right. That's right, because what they've done is criminal, invading Ukraine. And I want readers to know that I struggled with what I had been doing in Russia for the past 30 years. I really struggled with that when the war broke out and I went to Ukraine. As I was sitting on that long train ride, I had a lot of time to think about, what have I been doing? Why did I help the wrong country modernize? A country that I lived through terrorism, and I even promoted a charity concert when Russia suffered those great acts of terrorism. We did this charity concert based on Live Aid, the same model as Live Aid. We did that in Moscow, and now this country that I had helped in the middle of a terrorist epidemic was now terrorizing Ukraine. Everything was upside down for me. And when I returned from Kiev back to Warsaw to head home, I was depressed and angry. I was depressed that I had somehow been helping the wrong team all these years. And I was angry at the Russians. I had been to Bucha and I had seen the war crimes committed there. And I was angry at what the Russians had done, the Russian army. And I was in a bit of a crisis on that train. And all of a sudden, I am checking the news and I see a video clip of a famous Russian propagandist. He's like a Martin Scorsese type figure over there, but he's a propagandist supporting the war, talking about how Russia needs to win this war and eliminate Ukraine. Just really, really awful genocidal type talking. And he's being interviewed and he's talking about how it's the fault of America that more young Russian men are not signing up to fight in Ukraine. He's complaining that 1 million Russians have fled the country, and the young Russian men that are still in the country are just not willing to fight in this war. So Russia now has to go to the prisons and recruit from the prisons, recruit older men. You know, they have soldiers fighting older than 60 years old fighting on the front line. They've had to go to Africa, Central Africa, and try to recruit Africans to come and fight this war. Now they're trying to recruit North Koreans to fight this war. And this propagandist was blaming it on 30 years of American pop culture. Oh. And for me, that was vindication. It was a great moment that my efforts had made it, in part, harder for Russia to prosecute this war, and that maybe because of it, so many Russian men were refusing to do that. And that to me was relief that maybe what I had been doing those 30 years did matter. I have to say, Fred, that I think helping bring hip-hop music to Russia might be my lasting legacy there, because if you look at the people, the young people protesting the war the most, speaking out the loudest, especially the artists speaking out against the war, most of them are coming from Russia's hip-hop community. Really? And they are by far the bravest of all the musicians in Russia. And I'm just very proud that American hip-hop, East Coast, West Coast American rap made such an impact on Russia 25 years ago that today it may be the Russian hip-hop community that rises up and takes back their country from the Kremlin. And that's my great hope. And that's what I hope people take away from the book, Rockin the Kremlin.
Fantastic. Well, David, you had the most incredible life, and I'm glad that we got to tell your tale in your book. So
it was so much fun writing it with you. If it weren't for you, Fred, this would have been some academic business book for the music industry only. But what we have is a book about Russian culture and history.
And I had your life and your stories to work with, which is what made it so great. So thank you, David.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to know more about David's adventures in Moscow and more about the music industry and more about Russian culture, it's all there in our book, Rockin the Kremlin.